Hey guys! Check this out!
Is that a new camera?
This is the brand new AJA Cion. It can record 4K RAW for the laptop. It's got 12 stops of dynamic range. It's the future of cinema!
Whoa, we should totally take it to the lake this weekend and put it through some rigorous tests.
Good idea, actually. I'll call up EJ, and we'll roll out.
Yo. Yeah. Oh, cool. Yeah. All right. Oh, she's burning. Cool. Sounds good. Hey, how do you like your video? Raw or cooked? Sounds good. All right, I'll see you then.
This is the MPS Cookout. Welcome to our Shootout, where we will attempt to find out if a raw, uncompressed format truly has any advantage in image quality over compressed video.
For a raw and video comparison, we thought it was best to use a single camera. We went with the Cion because we wanted to see if it really was as bad as people were saying, and oh boy. The first important matter to discuss is our dropped frames. According to AJA, there are two options you have for recording in RAW. One is their $2,000 recorder, and the other is a MacBook Pro using their Cam Exchange software. We chose the latter. Unfortunately, AJA gave up optimizing Cam Exchange for future OSs. We had to reformat one of our laptops to Yosemite from 2014, and after all that effort, we realized it was just a broken port on the Cion. Good thing the Cage has two. And then more weeks go by, and then we realize that every shot we took on RAW looked like this. Looks pretty bad, right? Well, then let's get into the meat of it.
When we got to the lake, the first thing we wanted to do was go fishing, and you'll never believe what we caught. It was a perfect coincidence. We kept catching all these interesting and different charts that were exactly what we needed for the raw versus video comparison. A particularly colorful one stood out to us that we took back to the lab for analysis. The neutral patches on the Macbeth chart were first matched, meaning the red, green, and blue channel were brought to equal values to account for the tone scale differences between the modes. Within this match grade, the raw and video Macbeth charts shown here have colors that look very off, due to the color space differences primarily. These are followed by a single frame of raw, corrected in MATLAB. Thus, in order to truly match the raw and video, gamma and color space differences had to be accounted for. The raw code values were raised to a gamma of 2.0 and pushed through the Cion's Rec. 709 color correction matrix for a single frame. Doing so for all raw frames would take significant time and not be feasible for most productions. We were fortunate enough to get the Cion's built-in color correction matrices and lookup tables from AJA, but they are otherwise not publicly available. Without these, the match grade is the best we could do. The Rec. 709 video ungraded to look surprisingly good, with skin tones that were pleasant and realistic compared to the desaturated raw. After passing the footage through a match grade, it acquired a distinctly warm profile, while the raw still looked more desaturated than the video, especially in examining the eyes and the lips. The picnic we had prepared showcased some important memory colors. After performing correction in MATLAB, the raw colors ultimately looked more saturated and realistic than the video mode. The vegetation and logs were much greener, the fruit more delectable, the alcohol more inviting, and that Lake Ontario water looked just as freezing as you'd expect for an upstate New York winter. If time was of the essence for a project, then the 709 video wouldn't be a bad choice, but ultimately the RAW gave more room to play with for color grading decisions. However, the important factors to consider for choosing to go RAW is that there are no transformation LUTs or color correction matrices publicly available for use with color correction software like Resolve. Manual grades are the only options, but in the Cion's case, this is akin to giving Michelangelo a toothpick, or Picasso finger paints, or Stanley Kubrick an iPhone camera.
Some of the other guys decided they wanted to take a bike ride, but for some reason they did it in front of a giant green screen. So again, we just keep getting so lucky with these things. But before we talk about compositing, look at the raw green screen. That's a cyan screen. You think this would make it more difficult, but I actually found it way easier than doing the green. In Nuke, I used a pre-matte node, which allowed me to key out the green, or cyan, and clean up the alpha channel to make it look as good as possible. It also allows you to clean up some of the green spill that you see in the foreground, which is much more apparent in the video version. It was much harder to take the green spill out of the video side without introducing a number of different artifacts such as ghosting. You could already see in the background a lot of pixels are becoming clipped. The video does, however, have less artifacting going around on the edges. If you look in the RAW, a lot of the edges have white borders, particularly noticeable in the leaves. The video has a slight black border going around the edges, but overall, I would say the RAW is a much easier and more effective composite.
These next few tests on the lake will attempt to find out if it's even worth it to go through a RAW workflow if you're just going to end up exporting in ProRes 444 anyway. These comparisons were done by looking at the differences in the proxies that were made for all of our clips. Since all of our footage was shot in 4K, proxies are made in 1080 for ease of use during the editing process. Downsampling from 4K to 1080 also affords us better spatial resolution since we're sampling from a larger resolution to a smaller. It's important to note that between the RAW and the video footage, the color parameters are slightly different, which is why the color of the footage looks so different. But for this comparison, we're looking at strictly general image quality. And remember, our RAW footage had drop frames, so things won't look quite the same side by side. You can see in this beautiful uniform scene of the sky and the ocean, there's no noticeable difference between the RAW and compressed workflow. The details and the waves are making pretty consistent between the two, and the noise is relatively the same. This next scene has a bit more going on. If you look closely at the details in the musician's shirt, the ProRes video loses a slight amount of detail, but nothing incredibly noticeable. For high frequency information, we took the Cion on the road. As we cruise by these wonderful soccer goers, we can see that in the video footage, there's slightly less resolvable detail in some of the more dense parts of the trees. In the end, shooting in RAW does give you some benefit if you plan to export in ProRes, but the difference might not be noticeable enough to make all the extra storage worth it. You might just be better off shooting in ProRes to begin with.
It started to get dark, so we set up the fire pit and got ready to roast. We were going to have a movie project on the screen, but the lights were so powerful that they blocked the entire video. Now let's see if AJA was right about their dynamic range. We started by analyzing the raw footage. After setting the normal exposure to the people's face in the scene, we measured a couple other places with the light meter. Our scene definitely had more than 12 stops of dynamic range. Considering that AJA claimed that the camera had 12 stops of dynamic range, the Cion performed poorly. We measured 5.4 stops above normal on the fire pit, and we were about to clip there. For the lower end, we measured right next to the blue tent. We got a measurement of 3.5 under the normal, and we were about to crash. Also, most of the screen was clipped. We were very disappointed because we only got about 9.5 stops of dynamic range. Next, we checked the video file. The fire was completely clipped and the ground was completely crushed. But we were able to check inside the blue tent and we were about to crash there. That point was 2.3 below the normal. We were very disappointed again because we only got like 8.5 stops of dynamic range, and that's being very generous. Although we need to consider that having 12 stops of dynamic range in a scene is not very common. We unexposed the scene by one stop to see the effects on the highlights. The specular light still clipped in both RAW and video. Then we overexposed by one stop. We got information in the shadows for RAW, but video didn't perform as good. We were going to spend the night camping, but Rochester forgot that spring was a thing. Not even the fire could save us from that cold. Anyway, camping inside is also fun, I guess. With controlled low lighting, we were able to analyze the noise in 4 different games: 320, 500, 800, and 1000. We started by analyzing the 320 ISO footage. The spatial noise was not very noticeable in the video footage, but it was in the RAW, although the RAW had sharper edges. This made sense because our video was compressed, and we know that compression algorithms get rid of high frequencies, which in our footage were noise and edges. Also, temporal noise was noticeable in RAW but not in video. For 500 ISO RAW, the temporal as well as the spatial noise increased, but we were only able to see this change when we zoom in the picture. In video, we started to see spatial noise, but just in the dark parts of the picture. Shadows started to look noisy at 800 ISO. Temporal noise increased in both, but it was still more noticeable in RAW. The RAW difference with 800 ISO was not very noticeable. Finally, at 1000 ISO in video, even the midtones had both spatial and temporal noise.
There's a video.
Dude, I asked for RAW.
There's your RAW.
In conclusion, RAW only affords marginal benefits over video.
If you want to shoot RAW, you will need to consider that it's significantly more time and work because of the logistics and processing demands.
RAW looked better after processing and afforded more creative control than video. However, this is processing that had to be done in MATLAB frame by frame.
Additionally, there are no publicly available transformation lookup tables and color correction matrices to use in Resolve or other color correction software. And don't forget that you're also going to have to go out and buy an expensive processing engine to record RAW because the software requirement of backdating your system is steep. Not to mention, it doesn't work.
All in all, it is advised to avoid the Cion, especially if you're planning to record RAW.
But remember, we're talking about RAW versus video on the Cion. This isn't definitive for all cameras.
Thank you for coming to the MPS Cookout. We hope you learned a thing or two.
Or at the very least, not to use the Cion.
Cortège en partance vers des latitudes impudiques. Éclabousser l'éminence pacifique. Monarque ingénu fier, elle seule domine. L'assemblée docile chemine vers son parfum térémine. Agitation trop